Hey, welcome everybody back to the Antigen Security Cyber Risk Podcast. I am Steven Legg, CEO and co-founder of Antigen Security. I am joined today by the brilliant Kirsten Bay from Cysurance. Kirsten, you want to give a quick intro?
Hello, it's nice to see everyone today. Thank you for having me today, Stephen. And I'm Kirsten Bay, CEO and co-founder of Cysurance, an embedded cyber insurance program.
Amazing. Thanks for joining. So, just as a shout out to our viewers, we'll be doing the Antigen Security Cyber Podcast, and Kirsten will be joining me on a more regular basis moving forward. So, keep an eye out for those scheduling announcements as they come out. But today we're talking about cyber insurance underwriting requirements and some recent kind of case law / news stories that have come up in the industry. Kirsten, did you want to share a little bit of your thoughts on where we want to start today?
Sure, and I think it's important to level set in general about how this topic is coming up and why it's coming up.
Mm,
And that really is the question around these attestation questions that people are seeing and have been seeing for a number of years. And there are questions like, do you have MFA? Do you have a patch cadence? Do you have internal policies around wire transfers, etc.? And like many tick box type situations, for a long time, people went tick, 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 yes, 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 without really giving a lot of thought to that. And oftentimes they were protected by this best efforts clause. So they said if there were a breach, yeah, well, I was trying to do that, or was it being implemented, or so on.
mm,
But obviously, we have seen a great number of cyber attacks continually increasing, especially around ransom attacks. And so now there is investigation when these attacks occur by the insurance companies to determine whether organizations were indeed compliant with the insuring agreement and their attestation. It's important to remember that when insurance people talk about policies, they talk about the insuring agreement. That is your policy. And the way insurance looks at it, it is a legal contract and an agreement to which you are agreeing you're doing certain things and the insurance company will do certain things. And so, as Stephen mentioned, one of the most talked about cases right now is the Travelers case, where an organization claimed that they had implemented MFA after, by the way, they'd already had one ransom attack. They had a second ransom attack, and it turned out that when the investigation took place, that MFA was implemented on email, but not on primary servers. And so therefore, insurance was declined in a lawsuit to actually reverse coverage because it turned out that the attestation wasn't properly done. And so there are a number of things I think to unpack. And certainly, Stephen, I think that talking a bit about this MFA question is an important one in terms of, if you ask an insurance company, they'll say everywhere we want MFA. So we have to think about what that means. But also this thought, that that when you have these circumstances where many insurance companies believe that if you have one ransom attack, you're 30% more likely to have a second one. And so I'd also really like to talk about that probably to start, because there's a great deal of fear around multiple ransom attacks specifically. And that's really a lot what's driving a lot of these increases in premiums. And I'm not really of the belief, I think, as a contrarian, that that's really true. Not that that isn't happening, but it doesn't have to happen. So, what are your thoughts on that piece first?
Yeah, I think in considering that specifically that stat that you just called out, 30% of ransomware victims get ransomware again. Um, the important question to ask, if I would think if I were an insurer, would be why? Why and how do you prevent it from happening? It's certainly understood that folks that have been hit once are more likely to get hit again. They're on criminals lists. The criminal has some knowledge of their infrastructure, organization, etc. But I think to your point, from a carrier perspective, it behooves them to unpack why that is happening and take steps and measures to get in front of it, because that really certainly is possible, and we see that all the time working cases with our insurance partners.
Yeah, and I think that part of it, one is ensuring that the attack was properly removed, and I think that is one of the challenges is they remain rooted. But then the second one is were the right controls done? And post incident, if someone's applying for an insurance policy, one of the questions is what have you done to improve your controls? What new things are you doing to prevent this from happening again? And I think that this is like for someone who hasn't had a breach, but looking at what your particular risks are and the ways, and we talk about defense in deeper depth, right? What's the defense in depth strategy to limit the movement laterally of that type of attacker that might create a ransom attack? And secondly, what are we doing to ensure that this doesn't happen again just because we haven't properly implemented MFA as an example. So in this particular case, they implemented MFA on email, but not to the server level. And so therefore, that key information was taken once again.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. Well, and I would say kind of flipping it and looking at it from a incident response and recovery perspective, it comes down to whether or not insured are following all the recommendations that are made by their responders in those circumstances, because a lot of times, as you would expect, those things come up, and as a part of the diligence that we as investigators perform on in those circumstances, obviously the insurer wants to know what happened, how it happened, how it can be prevented, and essentially attribute those outcomes to specific levers. But a lot of times, my observation, just kind of raw off the street in the industry, is that organizations don't always take those recommendations to heart and apply them. They look to rely on that either a best effort clause or kind of their explanation that they're trying. But really clearly, as we can see in the case law, that's not going to be sustainable for them. It's not going to actually have the effect that they want. So kind of my takeaway for folks that might be experiencing this or are preparing for it would be, really make sure your T's are crossed and your I's are dotted. If you're implementing things like MFA, if you're attesting to something on a application for your insurance, you need to make sure that you have discussed with your internal or third party experts as to whether or not those statements are completely true and would stand up to scrutiny. That's one of the big, I think, outcomes of this, because like in our world, when we see partners, not partners, when we see folks like managed service providers um, filling out these types of forms on behalf of insured for the purpose of obtaining insurance, they're even gaining some liability there for
Right.
themselves, because they're they're making these attestations that the organization could derail if they make a wrong decision, take a wrong turn, whatever. So I think in terms of kind of how this practically shows up, all of those considerations are really critical, and I do think it's preventable. I think it's something that we're not talking about enough in the industry, and I think those practical conversations are critical for not only improving the quality of coverage and quality of claims and the claim experience, but ultimately making sure that preventable breaches are prevented.
Absolutely. And I think that, especially when we think about the SM middle market, small, medium organizations, that it does certainly feel like it's this infinite, deep, dark well, as I often say, around cyber risk. One is, I don't think I have it because I'm not a target because I'm a small business, or I just I just feel so confused by it that I don't know where to start, and so I don't start. And I think those are our two very common approaches, if you will, around that type of challenge. And so it's helping people get started to understand that there are some key critical things that an organization that can do to really limit severity, impact, and frequency. And the frequency question is one where we, much like car crashes, it's we have a robust car insurance market because most of them are fixable fender bender type things. But that's in cyber right now. So we have so many totals that it's the frequency and severity are both very high, and that's why we're driving so tightly to controls management, verification, and this will continue to increase over time because there still is this lack of understanding about how severe can it be and how broad is the evolution of these risks and attacks that are coming towards organizations.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Let me ask you a question. So inside of that, and you kind of started to answer this, but I'm curious to kind of unpack it a little bit more.
Mhm.
What do you think carriers need to take away from that thought specifically, and how can they adjust their, whether it's their underwriting requirements, their underwriting process, and the application process? What do you think the solution is there?
Well, I think there are a couple of things at play. So, one of them is what's referred to as the silent cyber risk, which is we as insurance carriers think that we've thought of most things either through exclusion, through controls management, through some vehicle by which we can measure risk and reduce potential impact of risk.
Mhm.
What is being found over time is that we think we've created this nice box that we can get people into, and they're in a moat, and then there's some crazy vulnerability or some exploit, a 0 day, some systemic broad outage, something like that that was not anticipated, and now carriers are facing huge losses simply because there wasn't language written around that type or particular type of vulnerability. So that's one area where there's just a lot of concern, and that's something that you and I have discussed quite a lot around
Mhm.
defense in depth strategy. Because even for the things that we know we haven't thought of just yet, the bank robbers' new methodology of breaking into a bank, we can limit the impact and severity of that event by having good, proper defense in depth controls. And so I think part of that part of the conversation for carriers is to understand what, one, defense in depth means, and two, how we can draw a decent amount of segmentation around that so that it doesn't end up being a 500 question application, but that
Mhm.
there are key areas where we can measure and understand where it breaks off an attack or limits the ability to move laterally in a network, as an example, because we've done these things, right? So gating and so on. So I think that's one area. And I think the other is, I have a lot of people say to me, oh, well, we have all this claims data. And it's like, well, that's wonderful. But in relationship to what? And that's the thing, that while we have a lot of claims data and it might be indicative that it's a particular set of controls or a particular set of items that allowed for that to become a persistent or large or severe attack, what
Mhm.
we don't know is in relationship to what. Is that 1,000 or 1 million or 2 million or 10 million people? And that's where I think we have another opportunity when we look at indicators of compromise that result in incidents, which result into breaches, is in that defense in depth strategy, where does that incident or IOC, that incident of compromise, get stopped or slowed down such that it doesn't flip into a breach? Because what we don't have is the comparable data between these bad things happen because of these lack of controls, not proper implementation, whatever we want to create as, or those variables. It's what we don't know is how often they're successful versus unsuccessful, and that's, I think, the biggest data gap that we have in terms of measuring risk.
Yeah, no, completely agree. And I think that speaking to what we do in the market, I think those are among the reasons that we've chosen to take the approach that we're taking. And that's certainly a topic we could unpack further. But um, you said some interesting things in there around controls, defense in depth. I guess what are your thoughts? What do you see? I'm happy to share my opinions. But what do you see in your world? Um, as those kind of differentiating emerging controls or things that are tending to make the difference in those circumstances.
Well, so if we go back to the genesis of this conversation,
Mhm.
MFA, it really does work, right? It'll, at least it allows for gating. And I think if we think about lateral movement or escalation of privileges, really the two things that are indicators or indicative of someone being able to move very quickly and persistently into root into a particular network, and then really exploit the network and whatever assets one's trying to get a hold of, whether that's money or resetting passwords or whatever their objective is. That these are the things that I think we can draw around, and we know that they're effective. And of course, that's why most insurers will say now, if you don't have MFA in place, that's an auto decline, period, right?
Mhm.
But then the next question comes, and this is, I think, a question back to you around the implementation, because for a lot of organizations, it feels onerous, right? It's just like, well, how long is a piece of string when we're talking about MFA? How many things have to have it? And the answer, a carrier will give you is, the more the better. But is there a way to think about that in terms of actually having a simplified implementation, or one that doesn't feel so large? What would that be in terms of starting a rollout where one prioritizes that rollout?
So I don't think there's a way to simplify it to the point of making it a non-effort. There's always going to be effort involved in implementing any security control, but
Mhm.
MFA being a kind of what I would consider a critical identity control, or identity and access management control, really, kind of the minimum viable strategy that we like to see, in general, is focused around two things. One, that you're not using, um, you know, lower sophistication, more exploitable versions of MFA, like, SMS push using text messages, and rather than that, using some kind of application, authenticator app, or other kind of um, third party way of handling those requests, so that it's not spoofable or exploitable in a way that's, the script kiddies in the world are going to be able to get to. But the flip side of it is, from an implementation perspective, making it a part of a broader identity and access management strategy is really the key to figuring out how to right size controls like MFA. Because if you're a 20-person accounting firm, MFA everywhere for you isn't really that big of a deal, and your focus may be more on things like establishing connection with your MFA provider, so that you can do things like single sign-on with all of your third-party apps, all the banks and financial institutions that you work with, and so adding that additional layer of security and identity management across all of those kind of panes of activity, versus, a 10,000 person manufacturer who, while we want to get MFA everywhere, may not need it in the OT areas on the shop floor, because those systems are self-contained and not accessible from the internet. But you absolutely need it everywhere that can get access to that, or access to the IT environments, right? So, um, implementing MFA for privileged access, or using a privileged access management system. Those are things that I think a lot of folks don't think about, and they just kind of stop the conversation at MFA, when in reality, a system like privilege access management can again help kind of refine exactly where and how this stuff needs to show up, so that it's not something, so that you're not requiring the same level of effort from a regular user as you are, a server administrator that's looking to make large sweeping system changes across the environment.
Yeah, and that's the thing too, is when we think about these attestation questions, it almost feels like we're starting to teach to the test again, where people are like, well, I just need to answer this for my insurance. And it's like, no, wait a minute. If you do the right things and we have the right implementation of our security stack, then those questions are answered. These should be verification questions and answers,
Yep.
not I'm going to lead my security strategy because of what the insurance application requires me to have. And so I think that's something that I feel like there's a lot of discussion around that particular topic. Like, I have to be able to qualify for insurance. And it's like, no, you have to have good security and you will qualify for insurance, right? And so I think it's also making sure that we don't put the cart before the horse in this particular conversation.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and that actually goes back to something, a quote that a friend of mine in the industry often says, which is, "Does your product dictate your strategy, or does your strategy dictate your product?" And in this case, your strategy being aligned around meeting those requirements or checking the boxes is really ineffective. But that also is why I think a lot of insurance carriers are looking at industry standards as a way of mandating the right behaviors without getting into a "you just need to check these boxes" conversation. The CIS controls, the NIST CSF, regardless of which one in particular you're talking about, they all kind of have that same effect. And so, I think from a carrier perspective, th- just unpacking that a little bit, thinking about it in terms of, implementing requirements for security programs that are aligned with those types of standards, and not just attesting to it, but being able to show that the strategy goes above and beyond just what the cyber insurance requirements state and require. um, I think would go a long way in terms of helping carriers navigate those waters more effectively, and setting up insured to have their claims fulfilled if and when they do have some kind of a claim need.
Well, and that's exactly the right point, because I do hear a lot from people that they're concerned. Well, what if I do everything that I think I'm supposed to be doing? What if I invest in all of these either managed services or other capabilities, and then there's some gotcha in there? And that's what people are very concerned with right now, is the gotcha. And I think that that's one of the challenges of now adding a question onto the application every time something goes wrong. And I review a lot of these applications, and you'll have ransomware supplements and other components to these applications, especially for more complex or larger organizations that have larger or complex network environments. And I look at these, and I don't think that the carriers realize that a lot of the questions are duplicative. And it's like, you really have asked this question 4 times. And when I look at a particular control, you don't really even need to ask this question. Like, if it's sort of like the parent-child type components of a security implementation. And it's like, if you have parent, you don't necessarily need to ask child questions to go along with that. I think so. I think partially, again, it's pushing back up to the carrier level to help them understand these key components are parent answers and parent questions, where the sub answers don't necessarily give you a level of granularity or understanding that really changes the outcome of whether this organization is insurable.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that's kind of the core or crux of the issue. If I have to call out one particular thing, I think technical measures and vulnerabilities and the exploits that leverage them will change and evolve over time, but defense in depth and security strategy, and essentially just having a mindful eye both on the detection and prevention mechanisms that you have in place, and how those relate to the big risks that you have, whatever size organization you are. That understanding and an approach that focuses on solving for that understanding is really the key. And I think that's why, next generation or cyber insurance, or kind of modern cyber insurance programs will specifically align around that type of thinking. And to your point earlier, I think the thing that needs to catch up is on the actuarial side. We as an industry have to do a better job of understanding those whys, and the how of preventing a lot of that activity.
Well, in addition to that, there are two elements that I think about when I think about the actuarial table. And we're certainly drowning in data, right? It's just, but what kind of data? And what I think too we really need to get better at is understanding, when we think about managing a network, and all of the indicators that we see there, I call it like the whole blinky light thing, right? We have lots of blinky lights, but not every one of those indicators of compromise may necessarily result in an economic loss that triggers a policy. And so part of this, I think, is separating things that happen in environments that could become vulnerabilities if uncared for, which may become an insurable event, things that we see that have to be patched, or misconfiguration that occur, all these things that are just good hygiene, diet and exercise kinds of things. But then there are the things that we know, if left untouched, will become more very likely will become, I'll say, a economic impact event. And I think that part of that is helping to separate those 2 points of, this is network activity and it may or may not be important to an insurable event. These types of things, probability wise, can very likely become. And I think it's helping people orient towards what results in economic impact, and how to drive to pull the data sets and to be able to help people prioritize and separate between those 2 points, because they're not all equal.
Yeah, no, completely agree. And I think the flip side of that conversation on the controls end is not all controls are equal, right? Like you need to be either an organization seeking cyber insurance or just an organization seeking to manage its cyber risk. It's important to identify kind of those critical controls and then build up from there rather than relying on point solutions or individual silver bullets that focus on one specific lever of risk but might miss others. So it's things like, to your point about MFA, having MFA mindfully applied everywhere that it can be, having endpoint detection and response technologies in place, having good third parties monitoring those. So what MDR provider you're using, and what type of threat intelligence and detection engineering they're bringing to the table to enhance your visibility and ability to detect even critical 0 days or other related activity. It's things like zero trust strategies, both for network access and internal. All of those things are as well as email and cloud security. All of those things are kind of what we would consider entry level security programs kind of stuff, to your point about like hygiene and just kind of basic care. But a lot of folks, and I think this is a big issue in the industry in general, a lot of folks don't necessarily see all of those things as a part of what they need to be budgeting for and spending and investing in proactively. They only sometimes implement those things when a third party is requiring them, and that mindset also I think needs to change.
Absolutely. And as you said, I do really want to hit the point about the point solution piece, which is that there's always, I call it security snake oil, right? It's there's no such thing as one thing being the thing, right? And that's a really important facet. And we would all dearly love to have that one magic solution. But the fact is like all things, it becomes cumulative. And that's really what I think the carriers are trying to get their heads around, because there was a long period of time, really leading up to 2017, cyber insurance was a cash cow. And it was, lots of people paid relatively low premiums. There were a few incidents here and there, but nothing so significant that it turned those portfolios upside down. One NotPetya happened, and then the ensuing period into COVID and beyond, where we were experiencing 600% increases, went to 1,200% increases. And if organizations were, say, 50 to 25 million in annual revenue, those groupings were like 1,600 to 1,800% increases over an 8-year period in terms of claims filings and attacks. And so it was very abrupt, and it felt very abrupt to those who were providing that financial backstop. And so there's this attempt to catch up and figure out, well, if we ask for the kitchen sink, then maybe we'll be okay. But it still feels like that it's leaking a lot, despite the fact that there are lots of questions that are still being added to the attestation. So I think for us as security practitioners and insurance people aligned, it is, how do we continually show that these implementations work, and they work in comparisons to those who didn't have them in place, so that we can show use cases where it's not claim versus no claim. It's, and so claims activity, the data from claims activity results in these bad things happening, but actually allowing us to show a benchmarking of how those controls and implementations and monitoring. I believe fundamentally that services like monitoring services need to be a component of security strategy going forward. Just the implementation enough is not alone. Alone is
Yeah.
not enough.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think the really challenging thing both for insured as well as the carriers is, how do you know what's good and what's not? And a lot of times when people ask me this question or ask Antigen this question, we talk about kind of how we evaluate and what we look for. And the point you're making there is really key and critical, because if you look at technologies like EDR, endpoint detection and response, or cloud and email protections, or MFA even, how you implement it and what value is derived from it is just as important, if not more important, than just having it, right? Because that the specifics and how it's applied, or how they're applied, are literally the major measure of how how much effect it will have on containing or remediating or preventing um, any particular circumstances that come up, from that could be a claim worthy event, right? And that's, in our experience, that's one of the things that is most commonly talked about and least answered, kind of in the public eye, because there's a lot of kind of pay for play marketing that happens in the security tooling space. And so it's often difficult for end customers, or carriers that are considering partnership, or just considering their requirements, how that should look, and what the measuring stick looks like for efficacy and for resilience. And I think that's one of the things that we focus on solving, kind of through our joint partnership for our insured, and the folks that work with us. And that, I think, is one of the critical problems to solve in the industry today, if I'm honest.
Absolutely. I mean, it's, there's always something more to buy, in that circumstance, if that's the way people want to approach it. But I think that really helping organizations also not feel like security implementation is business friction creation or
Mhm.
the business prevention unit, right? That these things, like, and I had a conversation not long ago where the organization is resistant to MFA because the senior executives don't like it. And so it does start from the top. And I think this is an important thing to think about broadly as we think about, can we get insurance? It's like, well, if the senior executives don't want to be beholden to the security controls, like basic controls, then there needs to be an evaluation of the commitment, the broad commitment of an organization to overall security. Because anymore, and this is the thing when we talk about types of insurance, right? And everyone largely has a general liability policy. Sort of, if you slip and fall in your physical space, if something bad happens to the building, property gets damaged, organizations have that. But when we all left our offices, the thing that kept us all going and kept us busy and kept our businesses afloat was our connectivity. And yet organizations weren't either adequately protecting them, adequately insuring them, or both. And yet, but this is the lifeblood of what keeps our businesses functioning, is our digital operational footprint. And we need to treat it with the same care and feeding that we do the rest of our business. And so having that internal commitment to security, even at the basic level, is something incumbent to every organization out there.
Yeah, no, completely agree. I think if you think about it, or put it into the context of um, another form of insurance, especially like non-technical executives get it a lot better. You wouldn't underwrite flood insurance without appropriate protections, or fire insurance without alarms and suppression systems and extinguishers. Like, the I think the major rift that has to be overcome in that conversation is seeing security as, not, to your point, not a friction creating or business impediment, but something that can enable you to do business more effectively, because you're doing it securely, responsibly, and effectively, with the security of your customers, third parties, and partners in mind. And I think that's where we see in a lot of conversations with individual organizations and partners, going through things like incident response planning at the and including senior executives or senior management in that process, so that they can understand and kind of put to practical reality what the impact of their business would be if X, Y, or Z happened. That's kind of a way to get that a view of what that looks and feels like without actually going through those circumstances. And I think that's why a lot of organizations kind of start their journey with something like that. If hopefully they don't have a claim or an incident that would kind of force them down that path on its own.
Yes, and when we think, if we take all that back into, how that drives insurability, how that drives the questions on the applications, all of these things are part and parcel of the same conversation. And so I think a lot of times it feels disambiguated between the two. It's that's a security conversation, but in fact, they really do go together. And the best efforts clauses are shrinking, but still what they want you to do is put in the best effort. I mean, we recognize that there are going to be mistakes or, gaps that happens, but just wholesale, I said I had MFA, but I didn't actually put it in the critical areas of our organization. That's when insurance will say, no, we're not paying for that.
Well, it comes down to, I think, best effort, or I'm sorry, what was the phrase that you used there?
The best efforts clause.
The best efforts clause.
Mm-hmm.
The best efforts clause, the changes that we've seen are looking to draw the line on what is a best effort exception versus what is negligence, right? And identifying that and understanding that from the perspective of the carrier really will help insured or folks seeking to be insured position themselves to be, kind of waved through that conversation as opposed to being the subject of scrutiny. Because at the end of the day, if you implement MFA everywhere and it's on every account, it's effective for both local and remote access. But then there's a 0 day that renders that control ineffective in some particular circumstance, and that led to a breach. That's much more passable and acceptable to a carrier than, oh, well, we implemented it everywhere but didn't put it on our VPN, or we implemented it everywhere but we don't have it for our administrators or privileged users. Those kind of exceptions, one, lead to greater damage and impact if an attacker actually makes it all the way in, but two, really kind of demonstrate exactly that thinking that you're talking about, which is, you know, just kind of negligently moving forward and assuming that it'll be fine, as opposed to identifying where exactly the line is for their given organization. And I think the challenge on the carrier side is that it can't just be an attestation based measuring stick. There's got to be a practical element to it to measure how that's being done, inside of their insured.
Yeah, and I think that the other component that organizations need to get comfortable with is this idea that networks need to be monitored and that proof has to be in place that patch cycles occurred. I mean, there are some carriers who are enforcing patch cycles to the point of after 45 days, there's degradation of coverage, right? So they really believe, and I agree with this, that having the proper patch cadence around critical vulnerabilities really does reduce and limit risk. And so it's those areas where we do need to be focused and to be aligned. And if one were to think about like all of the data that our cars collect, either through apps or through just the computers that are on the vehicle itself,
Mm-hmm.
there's very little you can hide from an investigation if a serious car accident were to occur.
Mm-hmm.
And yet what I find interesting is that there's, whether people like it or not isn't even a discussion, it's just what it is, and there's acceptance. Where I find a lot of pushback still is the pushing of data to either prove compliance or continuous monitoring to see if there are vulnerabilities still in place, or that one might be more subject to a 0 day attack because of either misconfigurations or lack of patches. That there has to be willingness on the company side to give a little on that. It's not that anyone wants to read everybody's emails, but that there has to be a willingness to show compliance, much like people want to show that I'm a good driver, so I deserve a discount. And when that discount conversation comes up, and it's like, well, I made this big investment in our security posture, therefore I should get a discount. Right now, what we're trying to say is that's great. You actually qualify for insurance now. And we as an industry really are not too much at a point where discounts can be put in place. It depends if one controls the underwriting or not. But that's just something to consider as well, is that there has to be willingness to give on the other side in terms of showing continuous compliance and proving that.
Yeah, and I mean, just speaking from my experience and working together with the team at Cysurance, I think that's one of the key differentiators and things that I like that we're doing differently. That at the end of the day, performance matters, and performance matters probably more than any other given data point, because it's the other side of that picture, right? Make the investment, meet the requirements, do all the right things. Those are all important, but getting a benefit, incentivizing that behavior, I think is the thing that will drive continuously organizations forward, and make them hesitate less and accept more, in that world of things, to achieve those kind of end results and continue to prove their performance. Right now, I don't think there's a lot of great mechanisms for abstracting that, but I believe that is and will remain a focus moving forward.
Absolutely.
Kirsten, I wanted to talk a little bit about another news story before we wrap up. Um, one that involved a marketing firm, and I believe Corvus Insurance. I know you had some thoughts on this. Do you want to chat a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Yes. And it is interesting, particularly in this use case, because one of the promises is the monitoring component that comes with some of these insurance policies, and that's part of the overall solution, is to help an organization understand that that there's either a network test or something that delivers insurability. When this organization was hit with a ransom attack, it took them down for over 2 months, to the point that they went bankrupt and filed bankruptcy and subsequently filed a lawsuit. And I'll, in full disclosure, haven't read the entire complaint in this, except for that the marketing firm did sue. I apologize. Apparently I'm sitting too still. So the light keeps turning off. But that they allege that they should have actually covered that Corvus and also their excess lines carriers, to give them additional limit, should have covered that claim. And the court ended up ruling in favor of the insurance companies. And so therefore this organization was left to file bankruptcy, and that was the end of it. And so one thing that people do say, just kind of broadly, is, oh, I don't know, I've never heard of a company actually really going out of business. And does that really happen? No, it happens a lot more than people realize it does. Um, but the broader question is, what drove the decline from that policy? There were arguments around, again, the network controls and whether they actually were compliant in its entirety, and that there were misrepresentations. But ultimately, there was a decline. And I think that there's a lot of mistrust now around insurance and whether cyber insurance will actually cover events. And so that's something I think that we have to think a lot about, in terms of when the global we are saying you have to do these things, or we will give you insurance. It is also tackling the consistency of insurability for the duration of that period of time that someone has a policy, and that they know they're going to be protected. And the unknowing, like the gotcha thing that we talked about earlier today, those are areas that I think we have to be very transparent about, and be honest and ready to talk about, because they are areas I think that cause people to give pause and whether they should even adopt these solutions.
Yeah, and I think I agree with all the points that you made, and from my perspective, what I see as a solution or path forward on that front really comes back down to something that we talked a little bit around, but didn't specifically touch on in the previous segment, and that is that over time, and as this area of insurance continues to mature, because it's matured, I would say, rapidly in the last 36 months, more than it has for the 30 or 40 years prior to that. Um, what we're starting to see now, and what I think carriers will gravitate towards, because they're tired of dealing with these circumstances, and the insured are subsequently not purchasing policies. I mean, I think the total number of insured organizations is something like 10% globally, that actually carry cyber insurance. So the number is very low, and I think it's because a lot of just like with medical insurance or other forms of insurance, there's a need for someone who's managing that portfolio of risk on the carrier side. There's a dramatic need for that, and that really is a model that has not been widely adopted by carriers, and I think but I believe that they will over the next 5 years continue to proceed further down that path, and that's one of the reasons that. That's so relevant to insured is that that takes away their risk on or mitigates a lot of their risk on the attestation side, because then they essentially have experts managing and implementing those things to the performance requirements of the carrier, and the carrier is signing off and approving that before there's even a claim made or a discussion of a claim.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that that's part of it. Is the standardization question is a big one, and I think one where we have to get better alignment. Just to your point, Stephen, I think that without standardization, it's very difficult to get to that point. That's really where the market is in entirety heading. When we look at other forms of insurance like homeowners, car, etc., there's a pretty good sample set of these are the standard things. Like everyone knows you get 100,000 of liability, and it's like you pick which drop down box you want in your car insurance, and off you go. The it depends nature of cyber insurance is still a real challenge for people. It depends on revenue and sector and whether you're the OT and IT, and and it just becomes very thorny very quickly. And I think over time we'll be able to understand kind of the t-shirt sizing, right? Where people fit in this bucket, it's one thing, and people there always will be the customized version. But for those organizations, they would expect to be in a situation where they would look at different manufacturing centers and so on due to the complexity of their network environment, and that's what it is. But for a good portion of the population, there should be the ability to standardize around a set of requirements and then called an application or attestation, and what then the other side of paying for those types of claims would be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree with that. Um, I guess as a final thought, um, one more question for you. In terms of takeaways from both of those, the articles and kind of topics that we discussed, what advice would you give to someone who's seeking insurance, and how can I guess what would you tell them in terms of putting themselves in the position of the carrier and thinking about how to structure their program? What takeaways would you or recommendations would you make to them?
Well, this might be like a really obvious statement, but the fact is that nobody on either side of that equation wants to have a ransom attack, right? So nobody wants it to happen. I think the challenge is when people think about these types of circumstances. When I've talked, as I know you have, of all the organizations that I know that have attack, most of them said to me, I just didn't really think it was going to happen to me. And so I did the minimum, or I didn't do very much, or we cut a corner here. And I think so when one is thinking about on the customer side, the insured side, don't try not to think about playing the probability game, but try to think about what are the best things you can do for your organization that reduce your risk in a way that aligns with what your budget is or what your needs are, but knowing that you can sleep at night, that if something bad goes wrong, that it can be contained, right? That you and I think it's difficult because we as humans actually are innately not very good risk managers. There are a million studies that have been done to kind of prove that. But that would be my advice to someone seeking insurance is first, get your house in order. The rest of it takes care of itself. In this circumstance, it really does. When one's thinking about the carrier side, it is, many people think, and it's, maybe it's sort of true. It's like, well, we want zero claims, but that doesn't happen. What carriers, it's important to know that up to like almost 80% loss against a premium, that's actually an acceptable loss ratio to most, right? So that's a pretty high bar. we're like way beyond that. We're at 100 and 200% of collected premium in terms of losses. So they're running a business. And so it's like, how can we figure out, we the carriers, to get people to comply with certain things because we feel completely blind? So if I'm trying to be compassionate to the carrier, it's how do I give them comfort that they're not blind to a potential risk, so they're not blindsided and have a massive loss? I don't want a massive loss. They don't want a massive loss.
Hmm. Yeah, you kind of answered some of the last question I wanted to ask, which was the flip side of that, right? So on the carrier side, what advice would you give to carriers that are looking to bring or enhance their cyber liability products in the market, and what can they do differently to write smarter and better policies?
Well, I think part of the challenge is one of the things when I talk to a lot of underwriters, and this is not anything other than the fact, which is many of them came from professional liability lines
Mm,
into cyber. So it's and so many carriers are investing in having groups that are really cyber oriented, that have backgrounds, that understand cybersecurity, that are helping to vet, different types of technologies and other components that help reduce those risks. I would my biggest wish for everybody is when a bad thing happens, one more question on the attestation isn't the solution to that problem.
mhm.
And so really trying to find standardization. This is the complaint everybody has. Please just have a set of standards that we can all agree on. Instead of I get an application for one carrier and there are 15 others that are different, and the applications are longer and shorter, because it makes it very difficult for organizations to feel like there's confidence in, if I just do these 15 things, what are those 15 things? No one agrees on that. And I think that it really, we always say this, that security is a team sport, and it doesn't change competitive capabilities for different carriers to also collaborate from the perspective of, you know what, uniformly this is what we expect to be in place, and then we'll figure out the nuances of that.
Yeah, no, completely agree. Completely agree. Well, Kirsten, thank you so much for joining. Thank you everybody for coming and watching. If you're having challenges obtaining insurance, or if you want to provide next generation cyber liability coverage, please do to connect with Cysurance or with Antigen to talk about our joint program. It's very, very groundbreaking and solves a lot of these challenges for both the carrier and the insured. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us, and hope to see you next time.
Thank you.